All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Conversations for the Future's January event. We're very excited today. We've got some great speakers lined up today to talk about space communication. Before we get started, I want to introduce myself. My name is Rachael Zisk, and I'm a reporter for Payload Space, writing a daily newsletter covering the business and policy of space and a weekly newsletter covering the science of space. So I will drop the links to subscribe to those newsletters in the chat below, but we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk and hear from our great speakers today. So I want to just jump right on into that with our first speaker, Paul Jurasin. Paul is the director and co-founder of the Cal Poly Digital Transformation Hub, leading a public and private digital innovation team focused on initiatives for moving public sector organizations into the future. Key aspects of his role are working with leading industry partners to develop new technology-oriented programs to promote digital transformation while providing enhanced learn-by-doing experiences for students, providing strategic leadership and executive relationship development with nonprofit, government, and educational institutions as the leader of one of the first members in the Amazon Web Services Cloud Innovation Center program, regularly speaking at conferences and events on topics involving innovation methods and digital transformation. Paul has more than 30 years of experience with digital transformation initiatives in both commercial and public sector organizations. Paul, it's great to have you on today.
Thanks, Rachel. Appreciate it. Glad to be here today. And again, thanks for Foundation for the Future for inviting me to speak again. I think this is maybe the second or third time I've spoken. So one of the things I wanted to do today, and I will share my screen here in a second, so you don't have to look at me the whole time. But one of the things I wanted to talk about today is, I know the topic is space communications this month. And I was thinking about, space communications and what we really want to talk about here. And there's a couple of different aspects of space communications to think about. And one is, of course, the technical aspect, right, where you talk about methodologies for transmitting data between Earth and spacecraft, and between spacecraft and spacecraft to planetary locations and that sort of thing. And I thought about that and I said, you know what, I'm not an expert on that. So I'm not going to talk about that. But there's another part of communications related to space that I think we do need to talk about, and that I can talk about from my history, is how do we talk about how to talk about space? So it's actually communications about space that I want to talk about, and how we use innovation processes and different techniques to be able to think about what we want the future of space to look like, and how we might use that to look at communications. So I'm going to share my screen here in a second, and I know this always sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. Let's try it. Okay, can you all see that?
Yes, looks good.
Yes? Okay, I'm going to try to share the whole screen. Sometimes that doesn't work either, but let's try that one. How's that look? Look okay? Or are you guys seeing it?
Better.
Okay, good. So just adjusting one little thing here. Okay. So one of the things we want to talk about today then is how to identify challenges and opportunities in space communications. Now I just have to be able to move my screen. There we go. So I know it's early in the morning on the West Coast, not quite so early on the East Coast. So you're going to see a bunch of interesting images, I think, in my slides, just to keep people awake and keep myself awake, I think. So you'll see my dogs, you'll see my wife, you'll see some interesting photos that I've taken. So they're all my photos. I didn't steal any from anyone. But what I do want to do is give you a little background on myself. And I know Rachel did some of that already, but so my history has been, I've worked for government organizations for about half of my career, maybe a little bit more than that, and with startups and public organizations in other parts of my background. But almost all of the background that I have has been in developing new technologies in various organizations around the country. So I started my career working for the Defense Department and analyzing satellite data. I worked for Digital Globe, which became Maxar, which is was the first commercial high resolution satellite imaging company. If you can see behind my head, that's a model of one of our first satellites back there. I worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I worked for the U.S. Geological Survey before coming to Cal Poly. So 10 years ago, I came to Cal Poly to work with the IT infrastructure on the campus. And then after about 4 or 5 years of doing that, I moved into the innovation role, which is the Cal Poly Digital Transformation Hub. So my background around the Cal Poly Digital Transformation Hub is all about working with governments, nonprofits, and educational institutions on figuring out how to solve difficult problems using the latest innovation processes and technologies, and applying those to those problems. So that's kind of my background. Outside of work, I've been a long distance trail runner for a long time. So what I see, this is going to be an interesting analogy maybe, is that when you're talking about big things like space, right? And how do we look at space and how we can move people to space, how we can have more operations in space? It's a long-term process, right? You can't do it today and it's going to be done tomorrow. There's a lot of persistence that has to happen, and you have to stick with it for a long time to be able to actually get ourselves there. Long distance trail running is kind of the same way, right? If you're going to run a 100-mile race, it's going to be difficult. It's going to take a long time. You got to stick with it the whole time, and you have to have persistence. I think that along with space kind of fits together. So anyway, just a quick background on that. Let me move forward a little bit. And as I said, you'll get some interesting photos. So with some of the questions that we want to talk about with space communications, or space in general, really, but in space communications, is how do we make us a multi-planetary society? How does this help now? And why should the public care? Those are all key questions that we need to think about, and how we might answer those questions. By the way, this is actually my dog doing some aerobatics on the beach. He certainly will try to do almost anything to catch that Frisbee of his. So today, then, what I want to talk about is a little bit about the innovation process that we use at the Digital Transformation Hub, which is a human-centered design process. But there's a little bit more to that I want to talk about today, because our innovation process that we use tends to address problems that people are having today, not necessarily problems people are having or opportunities people are having out into the future, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And I think that is what we need to be thinking about when we think about space. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the tools and methods that we use, and again, the design and futures thinking work that needs to happen to be able to really identify what we're trying to do in space moving forward. We'll talk about the problem statement and how we address the issue we're trying to work on. We tend to use a how might we statement. How might we have Facebook on the moon, for example. And then there's 5 questions that are kind of the core to what we do. And we always ask these 5 questions when we try to solve these big problems. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Okay. So what are the tools, right? So one of the things, and I guess I'll preface all of this with, when we do workshops that involve trying to solve problems for organizations like this, they tend to be a 2-day workshop. So I'm going to squeeze 2 days into 20 minutes. That's going to be interesting. But what I'll just do is kind of give you guys an overview on what it is we try to think about when we're doing the workshops, and how we think about the future and how we think about solving problems. And the process tends to work for not only space communications, but it works for government issues. We used it at Vandenberg Space Force Base on digital transformation. We use it to help solve the opioid crisis and developing applications for that. So it fits almost any scenario as long as you're thinking the same way about how to solve the problem. So in general, what we're trying to do here today is talk about, there's two ends of the spectrum, I guess I would say. The first end of the spectrum is, let's think about what we want the future to look like 10 plus years from now. So that's our future scenario analysis, right? Let's think about what we want the future to be like. And when you're thinking 10 years or more out, that tends to separate the realities of today from what the future could be. So those realities of today don't influence that thinking so much. So you can really open up your thinking so that you can say, you know, in the future, 10, 15 years from now, here's what I want that future to look like. I want to be able to have, you know, my family living on a spaceship that's orbiting Mars, and we'll be there for 5 years. It'll be a sabbatical for somebody. But in that 5 years, what are we going to be doing on that spaceship? How can we communicate with our family on Earth? How can we talk to the people who might be living on Mars, living on the moon? You know, those are the kinds of things we just want to think big about that. So there's the future scenario, 10 plus years out. And then if you work backwards, you know, 7 years, 5 years, 3 years, 2 years, and today, what do we need to do in that 10 to 15 years to be able to get to that scenario that we really want the future to look like? So those are two different ways of looking at things, right? You're looking at things that are happening today, pretty tactical, things that you're looking at 10, 15, 20 years in the future, which are pretty conceptual. So the idea is, how do we merge those two ways to think? And you know, there are people and techniques to do that. One is called futures thinking, one is called design thinking. Futures thinking is thinking out into the future, systematic way about thinking out into the future. And what we want to be able to do is prepare for what the future is going to look like and look at what we can do to shape the future to be how we want it to be, whatever those scenarios are. And in the workshops that we do help us to think through what those futures might look like and what we want them to look like. So, you know, this is just kind of a piece of what we work on when we work through many of the scenarios that we work on. So there's a couple of core principles that we think about when we think about futures thinking. And the first thing to remember, futures thinking isn't about predicting the future. It's about understanding signals and drivers that are happening today, and then trying to uncover patterns on where the future might go. So when I talk about signals and drivers, by the way, I guess I didn't mention, I'm certified in futures thinking from the Institute for the Future, not the Foundation for the Future, but the Institute for the Future. And in that certification, we talk a lot about what these core principles are. But the one thing that we try to remember is that it's not about predicting the future. It's about looking at signals, which might be, oh, what's an example of a good signal? Things that are happening in the world that don't seem like they're related, but then once you put them all together, you can say, oh, these signals all point to, you know, Tesla selling more cars, or private spacecraft launching horizontally to deliver satellites into space. We look like maybe we're going in that direction. You know, it's signals like that we look at, and then we look at why these signals are happening and why they might be related, and those are called the drivers, right? So perhaps a driver for horizontally launched space delivery systems are being developed. The driver might be lower cost, faster delivery is needed. We want to be able to be more entrepreneurial rather than, you know, the other side of that. What used to be the driver is we need big launch vehicles. We need to be able to launch heavyweight vehicles into space, and there's some need for that as well. But anyway, it's the signals and drivers that you want to be looking at and trying to understand what's happening in the world and how those are all connected. The look back to see forward piece of it is, let's look back and see how innovation has happened in the past and what path it's taken. And we might see that that path is continuing from today and into the future. So if you look at what happened 15 years ago and what you might have looked at and said, what is it going to be like in 2023? And I'm in 2005. Would we have predicted in 2005 what the world is like today? And if we would have, what path is that taken, and where are we going into the future? So let's look at those steps that are ongoing. And if there's something in that path that's ongoing and we don't like it, maybe we can do something to change that path to get to a future we really want versus where it tends to be going today. That's another thing we want to look at. And creating a community is really important in futures thinking as well. You want to have lots of people who are looking at what that future might look like. And even better, you want lots of people that are on the same wavelength to try to get the future to be where you want it to be. Foundation for the Future is doing that, of course, with much of the work they're doing. They're seeing that the government needs to support space infrastructure in a way to create a better future for the space industry, for example. So those are the kinds of things we want to look at there as well. So the Aerospace Corporation, a couple of years ago, some of you, maybe all of you, have seen this, and they created something called the Pathfinder's Guide to the Space Enterprise, but really they used futures thinking. They got a bunch of stakeholders and experts together, and they started thinking about what space might look like in 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And they mapped it out to see what the interactions might be between the different areas like workforce, exploration, resources, conflict, all of the kinds of things that might be happening out in the future. And they did a really great job of this. By the way, you can all go out onto the web and get it yourselves if you want. You can just search for Aerospace Corporation, Pathfinder's Guide to the Space Enterprise. And I thought they did a really great job of thinking about what the future might look like, and how to start looking at how we might change that future based on what's out there today. So futures thinking, future foresight, kind of related areas. And it's a really powerful tool, I think. Kara Kunzman and her team at Aerospace did a great job with this. So one of the things that's kind of core to what we work on is looking at the needs of the customer. The customer are really the people who are going to be affected by the decision that you all are making, or we all are making, regarding opportunities and challenges. Sometimes in the industry, software industry, people will develop really cool tools that don't solve any problem, but they look cool. What we want to be able to do is look at what we're trying to solve a problem for. And before we come up with a really cool solution, we should really know what we're trying to solve a problem for. So that is pretty important and core to what we think about as well. So then, now that we've looked at the future, we want to figure out how do we solve the problems today and more near term to be able to get to that future we want. So long-term to short-term thinking, human-centered design. What we do at the Digital Transformation Hub is really focus on the customer's needs and try to meet those needs while keeping the future goal in mind. And keeping that future goal in mind is really important. And we want to be able to drive to that goal, be persistent about what that future goal is while solving near-term problems and challenges. So, I mentioned those 5 questions. These are the 5 questions that we ask every time we try to solve issues and come up with opportunities into the future. We always want to understand who the customer is. Today, for example, if we're thinking about space communications, our customer may well be students who are in middle school or students who are in elementary school, because those are going to be the customer that's going to be utilizing the solutions that we come up with in the future. So we want to define who the customer is we're trying to solve a problem for, and what is the real opportunity that we're looking at, and why do we want to do that? So the other thing we want to look at then is, if we can solve a problem or come up with an opportunity, what's the real benefit for that? If we don't have a real benefit in solving a problem or coming up with a solution, we have to ask the question, why are we doing this? So we want to make sure that's clear. The fourth question is, how do we know what our customer wants? That's a harder one. And we want to make sure we include the customer, whoever that may be. Maybe it's middle school students, maybe it's their parents, maybe it's the workforce of today. But we want to include them in the problem-solving effort. We want to make sure their ideas and their thoughts and their opinions are included in everything we do. And then we want to prototype what the experience looks like before we go and spend $5, $10, $100 million on a solution. We want to make sure we create a low-cost prototype to be able to come up with that solution. So I'm not going to go through in great detail what some of the details are in our workshops, but we do an ideation workshop, which brings in subject matter experts and stakeholders, and we get them to talk to each other about what their needs are. We come up with hundreds of ideas, we narrow those down to a couple of really good ones, and then we take that idea, we bring it to life in the best way we can to get it in that customer's hands. Sometimes it's just a drawing, sometimes it's a digital prototype, sometimes it's a hardware prototype, but we want to get that solution in the hands of the customer so they can look at it and say, yeah, that's what I want to do. Nope, that's not what I want to do. This will work for me. It won't work for me. We want to get that information into the hands of the customer and listen to what they say about it, and then refine the idea and get it back in their hands and refine the idea some more until we come up with a viable prototype that looks like maybe this is really what we want to do before we go and implement any kind of a solution that's going to be expensive and permanent, right? We want to make sure that we can continue to refine that solution until we get it out in their hands. We then create a vision document with a clear, concise definition, and everything we just talked about ends up being in that vision document. And that vision document becomes the guiding force behind all of that solution development. And that vision document also needs to be connected to the future that we're looking for as well. So we want to make sure that future and the vision document of today, make sure they link together, because we don't want to be doing things today that don't drive us toward that future vision we want to get to. So that's another of the things we want to do here. So there's some core things. No, I'm almost there on my time. There's a couple of core things that we want to make sure that we're addressing when we work through the futures and design thinking methodologies and solving these problems. First is to think differently about the opportunities we might have. So by thinking differently, it really means understanding where we want to go in the future, out 10, 15, 20 years, and then look at what's possible today to be able to get us to that future that we see out 10 or 15 or 20 years. We want to take the steps to make sure we get there. So exploring the art of the possible is that. What's possible today? What might be possible in 5 years? And let's drive to that and make sure we keep that vision of the future in place. And of course, changing the culture of how we think is all about how we do this as well. I am going to do a quick summary and then I'll stop. So we want to be able to utilize the tools that we have available to us, make sure we use those tools in the way that can help most in identifying the opportunity that we're trying to identify, keeping the customer at the forefront of all of our decisions. So, in the human-centered design, we want to make sure it's the human that's validating what we're doing. We want to, of course, think about the future and what we want it to be, and then think big, create lots of ideas, make sure the solutions that we come up with benefit the customer, not only today, but in the future, and who that customer might be in the future. Visualize the solutions, and then, of course, test, iterate, and change as necessary to get to where we can actually develop the best solutions. And we want to be able to listen clearly to what we're getting back as feedback. Okay, I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions. Any questions? I know that was a lot of information in a really short time. Like I said, 2 days worth in 20 minutes.
Thank you so much for that, Paul. Yeah, if anybody on the Zoom has any questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat or just raise your hand and you can turn your camera on and ask yourself. I will prioritize those questions, but since we've got a few minutes here, Paul, I'm curious about what advice you have for envisioning a future that is realistic in the space context specifically, since I know that often in space, we have these kind of big dreams for the future and timelines for one reason or another just tend to slip further and further back as time goes on. So I'm curious what kind of constitutes a realistic vision for the future in the space context.
Yeah, that's kind of that's an interesting question, because when we actually are thinking about the future out 10, 15, 20 years, what may be possible in 20 years, we don't know what that is yet. But the idea being, what if you have that ultimate vision out there, even though it's 10 or 20 or 30 years away, you can start working on things that might drive you toward that vision. And there are other things that are going on today, and this is part of that signals and drivers thing that I talked about. You want to be able to see what's being developed technologically out there in the world today, where that's going as well. And you can start connecting those dots to say, you know what, they're working on a global infrastructure for satellite communications on Earth today with Starlink and Kuiper and organizations like that. How can we move that to, say, the moon or Mars or another planet where that global communications can happen there as well? So those are the kinds of things I think we need to look at. But I think thinking big and dreaming about what the future might look like, I don't think we want to limit that too much. Where we want the limits is what we can do in the next, say, 2, 5, 7 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Jonathan Josephson has a question. He says, how do you prioritize solutions from ideations?
So the way we've done this before is when we bring our subject matter experts and stakeholders into an ideation session, we come up with hundreds of ideas on how to solve a particular problem. And then we categorize those ideas, right? So different people are coming from different angles on that. We categorize those, we come up with the major categories that those ideas are coming from. And then one of the methods we use is that we let all of the stakeholders vote on what they think the best ideas are. One of the things that we do sometimes as well is we have people vote on what the worst idea is that's come up with. And what we find in many cases is the idea that came up as the worst idea ends up moving all the way back up to being the best idea, because it tends to be, the worst idea tends to be one of those ideas that people are like, no, we can never get there. Then you start asking why can't we do this? And people are like, well, because the policy says we can't do that. And we're like, let's change the policy. Or, it costs too much. Well, does it really cost too much? Or are there cheaper ways to do something? So anyway, that's how we tend to narrow down the ideas, is we have the stakeholders themselves vote on the ideas, and then we focus on how whatever we think the best ideas can solve the problem.
Very great. Really interesting. It's a really interesting way of thinking about the future and planning for the future that we want to have. So I appreciate your presentation very much, and thank you for coming on and sharing that with us today. I think if there are no more questions in the chat, I'll hold on for one more second. That is another second, but I think that we are ready to move on to our next speaker. So thank you so much, Paul, for joining us today.
Thank you.